A kind black teen helps an old woman by fixing her TV. Gibson thinks he has done good, but the next day Mrs Constance arrives with a police officer and knocks on his door. When he finds out the reason behind this unexpected visit, Gibson's life is changed forever. Before we get started, can you tell us in the comments section where you are watching this amazing story from? Also, don't forget to like and share this video. Gibson rode his bike down the street that was lit up by the sun. The warm wind blew through his hair. They were his favorite way to spend an afternoon, taking in the sights and sounds of his neighborhood. Something caught his eye as he turned the corner onto Maple Street. Mrs Constance stood in front of a small yellow house with a well-kept yard. The old woman was hunched over an old TV on her front yard, and her face showed how angry she was. Gibson slowed down on his bike because he was worried about his friend. When he walked by, Mrs Constance would always be nice to him and give him a warm smile and sometimes even newly baked cookies. But he had noticed that she seemed less social lately and spent less time taking care of her favorite roses. Gibson did not think twice before riding his bike to Mrs Constance's house. As he got closer, he could hear her talking to herself. She was fiddling with the TV's buttons, and her hands were shaking a little. Gibson said, "Hi, Mrs Constance," in a soft voice so as not to scare her. "Is everything okay?" The wrinkled old woman looked up with a look of surprise on her face. "Oh, hello, Gibson," she said, her voice warm and angry at the same time. "I think this old TV has finally given up. But I was going to watch my favorite show this afternoon." She lost her train of thought and pointed weakly at the empty box. Gibson felt a strong drive to help. He was aware of how much Mrs Constance liked her afternoon shows. She would talk to his mom a lot about the new shows. It hurt his heart to see her so upset. Gibson parked his bike and walked over to the TV. "Maybe I can help," he said. "I'm pretty good with tech stuff. Could I please have a look?" There was a spark of hope in Mrs Constance's eyes. "Oh, would you? Thanks a lot, Gibson. Thank you very much." Gibson couldn't help but notice that Mrs Constance's shoulders seemed to loosen up a bit as he knelt down next to the TV. He came to the realization that she might need more than just her TV fixed. She might have needed a friend after all. Gibson got down on his knees next to the old TV and looked at the back panel with his young eyes. Mrs Constance hung around nearby and shook her hands in worrying. "Don't worry, Mrs Constance," Gibson told her softly, giving her a comforting smile. "I will try my best to help you." Gibson began to look at the TV with soft hands. To make sure they were all plugged in right, he checked the cords. Then he carefully took off the back panel, which showed a mess of wires and circuits. Mrs Constance was amazed as she watched the boy work. For someone so young, he moved his fingers with a lot of confidence. His kindness and drive made her feel warm all through her chest. What Gibson did for a few minutes was interesting. Then he sat back on his heels and looked intent. He said, "I think I found the problem. This link isn't very strong. Let me just ... He leaned in close and focused on rejoining a small wire. His tongue stuck out a little. The TV suddenly came on, and the screen flickered before getting a clear view. Mrs Constance's eyes got really big in shock. She clapped her hands together and said, "Oh my goodness. You did it, Gibson. You did it." Gibson stood up and wiped his hands clean on his pants with pride. He was humble and said, "It wasn't too hard. I'm glad I could help." The boy made Mrs Constance cry happy tears as she looked at him. She spoke with a heavy heart. "Thank you so much, Gibson. You have no idea how much this means to me. This old TV was a gift from my late husband. I thought I had lost it for good." Gibson could feel a lump in his throat. He didn't know how important Mrs Constance thought the TV was to her. That made him feel even better. He had fixed it. Mrs Constance's face lit up with a thought all of a sudden. "Yes, I know. Come on inside for some cookies. I made a new batch this morning. It's the very least I can do to thank you." Gibson's eyes lit up when you said cookies. "That sounds great, Miss Constance, thanks." She put a soft hand on Gibson's shoulder as they walked toward the house. She said in a soft voice, "You're a very special young man, Gibson. Your mom and dad must be very proud of you." As soon as they walked inside, Gibson felt happy. He didn't just fix a TV today. He made Mrs. Constance smile, which was even better than fixing something mechanical. Gibson sat down at Mrs. Constance's kitchen table and was thrilled when she put a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies in front of him. The cozy room was filled with a sweet smell that made his mouth water. Put a glass of cold milk down next to the cookies and say, "Here you go, dear. Enjoy." Gibson enjoyed the gooey chocolate chips in a big bite of a cookie. He yelled, "These are amazing, Mrs. Constance," but his voice was dampened because he had a cookie in his mouth. Mrs. Constance laughed, and her eyes lit up with happiness. "I'm glad you like them. I haven't baked for anyone in a while." With their snack in hand, Mrs. Constance started to tell tales from her past. She talked to Gibson about her brave late husband, who had been a police officer for many years. She talked about him with teary eyes, and Gibson felt a pain in his heart. "It's been quiet since he died," Mrs. Constance said in a soft voice. "The house feels so empty sometimes." Gibson listened carefully, and he felt both sad and sorry for the kind old woman. It was clear that Mrs. Constance was lonely, and his young heart hurt for her. Gibson reached out and gently pat Mrs. Constance on the hand. "I'm sorry you've been feeling lonely. That must be very tough." Mrs. Constance smiled at him because he seemed to understand. "What a nice boy you are, Gibson. Your visit today made my whole week better." She said something that made Gibson smile and feel happy. "I fixed Mrs. Constance's TV and ate cookies with her," but he was glad he could make her feel better. When they were done with their lunch, Mrs. Constance had a bright idea. She told him, "You know, Gibson, you can come over whenever you want. I always have fresh cookies, and I'd love to have you over." Gibson got a big smile on his face. "Really? Mrs. Constance, that would be great. I'd love to visit you again." Mrs. Constance gently squeezed Gibson's hand. "Gibson, you've made this old house so much fun today. Thanks for that." Gibson rode his bike home with a happy heart and a high mood. As he pulled into his driveway, the long shadows of the warm afternoon sun fell across the quiet streets of the suburbs. He couldn't wait to tell his parents about Mrs. Constance's afternoon with him. As he walked through the front door, the smell of his mom's homemade lasagna filled the room. "Mom and Dad, I'm home," Gibsontifer yelled out, his voice filled with joy. Mr. and Mrs. Ondas came out of the kitchen with big smiles on their faces. Mrs. Ondas said, "Welcome home, sweetheart," wiping her hands on her apron. "How was your ride?" Gibson's words came out quickly. "It was great. Mrs. Constance let me come over for cookies after I helped her fix her TV." Mr. Ondas raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Are you Mrs. Constance from across the street? Thanks a lot for that, son." Gibson happily nodded. "It was her plan to carry it to the curb, but I offered to look at it. Making it right wasn't too hard." It made Mrs. Anders's eyes shine with joy. "That's great, Gibson. I am sure Mrs. Constance valued your help a lot." Gibson calmed down and said, "She did. She looked like she was lonely. She probably just wanted to talk to someone." The boss put his hand on Gibson's shoulder. "Son, you did a good thing today. It's so important to help other people, especially our friends. It's what makes a neighborhood strong." Mrs. Ondas agreed and nodded. "That's right. Also, it's very important to watch out for our elderly friends. They often need a little extra help and someone to talk to." Gibson's chest felt full of happiness. He was glad that what he did was okay with his parents. "Mrs. Constance told me I could go see her whenever I wanted. Is that all right?" His parents looked at each other with joy. The man replied, "Of course it is. Thank you for getting in touch with Mrs. Constance today. You've really been kind and caring." Gibson got up early the next morning, excited to see Mrs. Constance again after breakfast. It made him excited. As he got on his bike and pedaled down the street, Gibson saw Mrs. Constance taking care of her flower bed in the front yard as he got closer to her house. When she saw him, she became very happy and smiled. What a wonderful surprise, Gibson, when Mrs. Constance called out. She waved her gardening gloves around. Gibson put his bike down and went to talk to her. "Hello, Mrs. Constance. I wanted to see how things were going with you and the TV." Mrs. Constance was so happy that her eyes wrinkled. "Oh, dear. It works just fine. You did a great job. Would you like to spend some time inside?" Gibson gave an excited nod. "Of course, I'd love to." As they walked into the cozy living room, the TV stood tall and looked good. Mrs. Constance waved for Gibson to sit down on the flower-patterned couch. "May I get you something to drink? How about some lemonade?" she asked. Gibson responded, "Thank you, that sounds great." Gibson looked around the room while Mrs. Constance was busy in the kitchen. A picture of Mrs. Constance when she was younger with a man in a police outfit caught his eye. Gibson had to ask, "Is that your husband in the pictures?" When Mrs. Constance came back with 2 cups of lemonade, Mrs. Constance's smile turned sad. "Yes, that's my Henry. He worked as a police officer for more than 30 years. 5 years ago, he died." Gibson had a sad feeling. "Dear Mrs. Constance, I'm sorry. It looks like he was a good person." "He was the nicest and bravest person I've ever met," she said softly. For a moment, they sipped their lemonade in peace and quiet. After that, Mrs. Constance got happier. "How about we watch TV together? Right now, there's a beautiful nature show on." Gibson gladly agreed, and Mrs. Constance turned on the TV. They talked about the birds and shared interesting things they knew. While watching the bright birds fly across the screen, we laughed and told stories the whole afternoon, which went by quickly. Mrs. Constance told Gibson stories from her childhood, while Gibson talked about school and his interests. It became clear to Gibson that it was time to go home as the sun went down. "Mrs. Constance, I think I should go now." He stood up and said, "Thank you for having me over." Mrs. Constance gave him a soft pat on the hand. "Gibson, thanks for coming. You made my day better in more ways than you." Over the course of a few weeks, Gibson's trips to Mrs. Constance's house became normal for him. He was always so excited when he got on his bike after school and rode down the street every few days. Mrs. Constance always had a smile on her face and her arms wide open when she saw him. She would say, "There's my favorite young man," with happy tears in her eyes. They got used to spending the afternoons together in Mrs. Constance's cozy living room and fell into a routine. They would sit and talk sometimes and watch TV other times. Gibson was getting more and more excited about these trips. After a long day outside, Mrs. Constance took out an old picture album as they sipped lemonade. She said with a nostalgic tone, "I thought you might like to see some pictures from when I was young." Gibson leaned in closer because the black and white pictures were so interesting to him. He looked at a picture of a young woman in a pretty dress and asked, "Wow, Mrs. Constance, is that really you?" Mrs. Constance laughed. "Yes, that's me on my wedding day. I was only 22 years old." She told stories from her past as they looked through the pages. She told Gibson about her simpler childhood, how she met her husband, Henry, at a dance, and the fun things they did together. "Henry and I took our little camper van on trips all over the country," she said, her eyes wide. "Those were some of the happiest days of my life." Gibson paid close attention and hung on every word. During those times, he thought about what it must have been like to live On the other hand, Gibson told Mrs Constance about his own hopes and dreams. He told them, "When I grow up, I want to be an engineer. I love fixing things and figuring out how they work." Mrs Constance gave a thumbs up sign. "That's great, Gibson. It's clear that you're good at it. I'm sure you'll come up with something great someday." Gibson smiled when she told him to keep going. "Do you really think so?" The woman answered with a soft smile. "I know that. You've got a bright future ahead of you, young man." As they talked about their dreams and stories, their bond grew stronger. Gibson found a patient listener and wise friend in Mrs Constance. Mrs Constance, on the other hand, found in Gibson a source of young energy and hope for the future. While having dinner one night with the Onders family, Mr. and Mrs. Onders looked at each other knowingly. They had seen how Husband always looked when he got home from Mrs. Constance's house. His eyes were wide, and his words came out quickly as he talked about their time together. "So, Gibson," Mr. Onders said with a smile, "you've been hanging out with Mrs. Constance a lot lately. What's she up to?" Gibson's face lit up when his old friend was brought up. "That's great, Dad. She showed me old pictures of herself when she was younger today. She and her husband took a camping van across the country. Did you know that?" Mrs. Onders let out a soft laugh. "That sounds like a fun adventure. It's great that she's telling you about those moments." Gibson kept talking excitedly about his visits with Mrs. Constance, and his parents listened carefully, their hearts full of joy. When the talk stopped for a while, Mr. Onders cleared his throat. He told him, "Your mother and I are really proud of what you're doing for Mrs. Constance." His voice was full of feeling. Gibson was shocked and looked up from his food. "Really? But I'm not doing anything unique. I just enjoy being with her." She put her hand on Gibson's and squeezed it. "Yes, that's what makes it unique, honey. Just being there for her makes a big difference in her life." Mr. Onders agreed and nodded. "That's right. We have seen that Mrs. Constance is happy these days. She values your friendship a great deal." Gibson felt good inside when his parents talked to him. He wasn't aware of how his presence was changing Mrs. Constance's life. He only knew he liked spending time with her. "You are so brave to see that Mrs. Constance needed a friend," Mrs. Onders said with pride in her eyes. "It takes a kind and compassionate heart to reach out to someone like that." Gibson spent more and more time at Mrs. Constance's house over the next few weeks or so. He was always happy to help, and each visit gave him something new to do. When Gibson got there one warm afternoon, Mrs. Constance was having a hard time with a jar lid. "Oh, Gibson," she yelled. Her face lit up with happiness. "I'm so glad you came. These old hands aren't as good as they used to be." Gibson smiled and took the jar from her. He quickly turned the lid around and took it off. "So there you have it, Mrs. Constance, simple as that." The corners of Mrs. Constance's eyes got warm. "What would I do without you, dear?" Gibson helped with many small tasks around the house as the days went by, to make Mrs. Constance's favorite tea just the way she liked it. He even learned how to change light bulbs that were too high for her to reach. Gibson was helping Mrs. Constance go through old photo books. One day, when she stopped on a picture of a boy, "That's my late husband when he was your age," she said in a soft voice. "You know, you remind me so much of him. Always willing to help and always smiling." Gibson could feel a lump in his throat. That made him feel something. "Really?" he asked. Mrs. Constance nodded, and tears came to her eyes. "Yes, of course. Should we have had grandkids, I think they would have been a lot like you." After that, something changed in their bond. Like a grandmother, Mrs. Constance started to fuss over Gibson. When he came over, she always made sure he had a snack, and checked to see if he was warm enough when it got cold. Gibson helped Mrs. Constance out as a friend, but she was also someone he could talk to about anything and who always had something wise or funny to say. He was excited to spend time with her and hear more about her life. He also wanted to talk about his own hopes and fears. As the leaves turned colors in the fall, Gibson understood that what began as a small act of kindness had grown into something much more valuable. Mrs. Constance was no longer just a friend. She was like family. Gibson had a great thought when he woke up on a cool Saturday morning. He was so excited that he almost tripped down the stairs as he jumped. His parents were having coffee in the kitchen in the morning. Gibson yelled, "Mom and Dad, I want you to meet Mrs. Constance." Mr. Ondas put down his newspaper and raised an eyebrow. "The neighbor you've been helping out?" Gibson happily nodded. "Yeah, she's really nice, and I think you'd like her." Mrs. Ondas gave a warm smile. "That sounds lovely, honey. Why don't we go over this afternoon?" Gibson's face lit up. "Really? That would be great." With the afternoon coming up, Gibson was both excited and nervous. His dad wanted his mom and dad to like Mrs. Constance as much as he did. The Ondas family went to Mrs. Constance's house together when the time came. Gibson jumped up and down and knocked on the door. Mrs. Constance broke out in a big smile when she opened it. "Gibson, what a wonderful surprise." "Hi, Mrs. Constance," Gibson said with a smile. "I wanted you to meet my parents." She looked at Mr. and Mrs. Ondas with eyes that shone. "Oh my, it's great to meet you at last. Please come in." As they sat down in Mrs. Constance's cozy living room, Gibson watched with worry as his parents started to talk. But he stopped being worried when he saw his mom laugh at one of Mrs. Constance's jokes and his dad lean in to listen to a story about her late husband's time as a police officer. That was Mrs. Anders's soft eyes as she looked at Gibson. "I can see why you love coming here so much, honey. Mrs. Constance is lovely." Mr. Ondas agreed and nodded. "It's wonderful to see how much joy you two bring to each other's lives." Gibson's chest felt warm as he looked at Mrs. Constance. She winked at him, her eyes shining with joy. Gibson knew at that moment that his two families had joined together out of love and kindness. The Ondas started to include Mrs. Constance in more and more of their family events as the weeks went by. It all began with an easy offer to Sunday dinner. Mrs. Constance got a call from Gibson's mother on a Friday afternoon. Her voice was friendly and warm. "We'd love for you to join us for dinner this Sunday, Mrs. Constance. We feel like you're already part of the family because Gibson talks about you so much." Mrs. Constance's voice shook with feeling as she said yes to the invite. "Wow, that's really nice of you. It would make me happy." When Sunday came around, Gibson was so excited he could hardly hold it in. He helped his mom set the table and make sure everything was just for their guest. The house was filled with the smell of Mrs. Anders's famous pot roast and the sound of happy talk when Mrs. Constance got there. During dinner, Mr. Ondas told everyone funny stories from work, and Mrs. Constance told stories about the fun things she did with her late husband. While Gibson was happy, his parents and Mrs. Constance laughed together. It was like they had known each other for years. Soon, the Ondas family was inviting Mrs. Constance to other family events as well, and the Sunday dinners became a regular thing. They asked her to come with them to the park for a picnic one sunny Saturday. Mrs. Constance was so happy as they spread out their blankets under a tree that provided shade. "I haven't been on a picnic in years," she told him, her voice full of surprise. Gibson helped her lay down on the blankets and made sure she was comfy. In the afternoon, they ate sandwiches, played frisbee with Gibson's mom, and watched Mrs. Constance feed the ducks at the pond while cheering her on. As the weeks and months went by, Mrs. Constance became an important part of the Ondas family's life. She went to movies with them, helped Mrs. Ondas take care of her garden, and even went with them to the neighborhood museum. The friendship between them grew stronger with each trip and meal they shared. Gibson knew that what started as a small act of kindness had turned into a beautiful, long-lasting friendship. They became closer together. These times were like a new start for Mrs. Constance. The loneliness that had been killing her started to go away, and the love and kindness of her new family took its place. Gibson was also happy when he saw Mrs. Constance's smile when she was a part of their activities. Gibson was working on his latest computer project while lying on the living room floor on a sunny afternoon. As he hummed a happy tune, his fingers moved small wires and parts with ease. The only sounds in the house were the clicks of his tools and the soft humming of the ceiling fan. The quiet silence was broken by a loud knock at the front door. Gibson looked up, and his young face showed that he was interested. It was Mr. Anders's favorite chair, and he was reading the newspaper. He put down his paper and got up. He yelled, "I'll get it," and walked to the door. Gibson craned his neck to see who it was when Mr. Anders opened the door. He was shocked to see Mrs. Constance standing on the porch with other people. A tall police officer in full dress stood next to her. His badge sparkled in the afternoon sun. Gibson's heart beat faster. It was hard for him to think straight. Why was Mrs. Constance here with a police officer? What went wrong? He quickly got up, leaving his job on the floor. As he met their unexpected guests, Mr. Anders's voice had a worried tone to it. "Mrs. Constance, officer, is everything all right?" Gibson couldn't quite put his finger on Mrs. Constance's face. It showed worrying, joy, and something else. Her hands were shaking as she looked up at Mr. Anders, she started. "Oh, Mr. Anders," her voice a little shaking. "I'm so sorry to bother you like this, but something happened, and I didn't know who else to talk to." The police officer next to her gave her a solemn nod. His presence was both comforting and scary. Gibson moved toward the door slowly. His heart was racing with fear and interest. Mr. Anders moved out of the way and waved for Mrs. Constance and the police officer to come in. "Please come in," he said with worrying in his voice. Mrs. Anders came out of the kitchen and wiped her hands on a dish towel. She was shocked and had wide eyes. Gibson stood still. He was very young and had a lot of questions in his head. His stomach was turning with worrying as he watched the adults come into the living room. What could have happened to make Mrs. Constance and the police officer come here? "May I get you something? Water, tea?" Even though there was stress in the air, Mrs. Anders offered, her friendly personality shining through. Mrs. Constance shook her head, and the light caught in her silver hair. "No, thank you, sweetheart. I'm sorry to bother you this way." The police officer, a tall man with kind eyes, gave the Anders a polite nod. "Hello, my name is Officer Ramirez. Mrs. Constance asked me to come with her." Gibson moved closer to his parents because he wanted to feel better being with them. Gibson could feel his father's comforting hand on his shoulder, but it was shaking a little. "What's going on? What is it?" Mr. Anders asked, his voice calm but full of worrying. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Constance?" Mrs. Constance shook her hands and looked back and forth between Officer Ramirez and the Anders. She kept saying, "I didn't know who else to turn to," her voice shaking each time. Gibson's heart beat fast. She was so upset that he had never seen her before. She had always been a rock of strength and knowledge when they spent the afternoons together. He felt scared and useless when he saw how upset she was. Taking Mrs. Constance by the hand and saying, "Maybe we should all sit down, Mrs. Anders proposed. The others did the same thing, and Gibson sat down on the cushion next to his mother. Officer Ramirez blew his nose. As he began, "Mrs. Constance came to the station today with some concerns." His tone was both professional and caring. Gibson looked at Mrs. Constance with worrying in his eyes. When she looked at him, her worried face relaxed for a moment. She reached out and gave him a soft pat on the hand. "Oh, Gibson," she said softly, "I'm sorry to worry you this way. You've been such a great friend to me." There were a lot of questions in the air, but no one said a word. Gibson didn't know what to think because he was both interested and scared of what Mrs. Constance might say next. He looked at his parents and saw that they were just as confused as he was. Officer Ramirez leaned forward and put his hands together in front of him. Mr. and Mrs. Ondas Gibson, I want you to know that everything is fine here. No one is in danger or has done anything wrong. The whole room let out a sigh of relief. Gibson's shoulders felt less tense, but his interest only grew. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue that Mrs. Ondas had given her in a quiet way. I'm so sorry for scaring you all, she said in a shaking voice. It's just, well, I've been thinking a lot about my dear Henry lately. Gibson knew that Henry was Mrs. Constance's late husband because she often talked about how much she loved her as a police officer when they talked in the afternoon. You see, Mrs. Constance said with tears in her eyes, today would have been our 50th wedding anniversary. Her voice broke, and she took a moment to calm down. The Anders looked at each other with sympathy, and Gibson could feel a lump growing in his throat. It broke his heart to see Mrs. Constance cry. I felt so alone, Mrs. Constance continued, and I ended up at the police station where Henry used to work. That's where I met Police Officer Ramirez. She held out her hand to the friendly police officer. Officer Ramirez smiled and nodded. Mrs. Constance told me about her husband, about their life together, and about the wonderful friendship she's formed with your family, especially young Gibson here. Gibson felt proud when the officer spoke, but that pride was quickly overwhelmed by worrying about Mrs. Constance. Gibson's hand was taken by Mrs. Constance. Gibson, you've made my life so much better these past few weeks. You made me remember what it's like to have family around. She turned around to face the Anders, and her eyes were filled with tears. And you've all been so kind, including me in your lives. She stopped and took a deep breath. I've come to the conclusion that I no longer desire to be alone. I hope and want Mrs. Constance's voice was shaking because she was so upset. She took a deep breath, and tears were still in her eyes. My Henry, she said in a soft, loving voice. He was a decorated police officer. He always put the community first and helped other people his whole life. Gibson paid close attention, and his young heart swelled with respect for Mrs. Constance's late husband. He knew some things about Henry, but never the whole story. Henry thought that being kind was the most powerful thing in the world, Mrs. Constance said, as she gently squeezed Gibson's hand. He used to say that a single act of kindness could change someone's entire life. The Anders nodded and looked at each other in a way that showed how well they understood this simple but deep truth. Mrs. Constance looked at Gibson with warm eyes. And you, dear Gibson, have shown Henry to be right. Your goodness has filled a hole in my heart that I thought would never be filled again. Gibson got a lump in his throat as Mrs. Constance's words touched him, that he didn't know how much his small acts of friendship meant to her. I felt so alone when Henry died, Mrs. Constance said, her voice shaking a little. It felt like a piece of me went with him. After that, Gibson, you showed up with your friendly smile and ready to help. She stopped and looked at the Anders. Thank you all for letting me into your lives. It's been like getting back in touch with family. Officer Ramirez smiled and nodded. Mrs. Constance told me how you fixed her TV, Gibson, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into this beautiful friendship. Gibson blushed, feeling proud and embarrassed at the same time. He didn't think what he did was very important, but it was clear that it made a big difference in Mrs. Constance's life. You see, Mrs. Constance said, her voice getting stronger. Gibson's kindness fixed more than just my TV. It fixed something in me that I thought was broken for good. It made me think of how great it is to be connected with family. Mrs. Constance's eyes got teary. She went on with her story. As she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You see, Henry and I never had children of our own. All eyes were on her, and the room went quiet. Gibson's heart hurt. This was something new he learned about Mrs. Constance that helped him get why she was so lonely. She then dabbed her eyes with a tissue and said, "After Henry died, I felt so alone. It was so quiet and empty in the house. I had no idea what to do." The Anders looked at each other with sadness as they thought about their elderly friend. Mrs. Constance turned to look at Gibson, and her eyes were filled with love. "But then you showed up, Gibson. It's been like a ray of happiness in my life, having you visit and be kind." Gibson thought. He felt a lump in his throat. He did not know how much his visits to Mrs. Constance meant to her. "Every time you come over, every story we tell, and every moment we spend together makes my heart so happy," Mrs. Constance went on, her voice getting louder. "It's like having the grandson I never had." Gibson's eyes got really big when he heard these words. A warm feeling spread through his chest. It was a mix of wonder and happiness. Gibson's hand was taken by Mrs. Constance. "You're like family to me now, Gibson. You've made my house laugh again and given my days meaning again." Gibson gave her a light squeeze on the hand, feeling how deeply her words hit him. The proud smiles on his parents' faces made him look up at them. He then turned back to Mrs. Constance. I feel the same way, Mrs. Constance," Gibson said in a low voice. "Having fun with you is great. You're also like family to me." Mrs. Constance's face lit up with happiness, and the tears that had been on her face had turned into a beautiful smile. They became close through small acts of kindness, and now their bond was something beautiful and deep. The police officer, who had been sitting next to Mrs. Constance, quietly got up. When he talked to the Anders family, he had kind eyes and a soft smile. "Hi, I'm Officer Martinez," he said in a friendly voice. "I was a close friend of Henry, Mrs. Constance's late husband." Gibson raised an eyebrow at the cop and looked at him with interest. He could tell Officer Martinez liked and respected what he was saying about Mrs. Constance's husband because of the look on his face. Officer Martinez went on, "Henry was one of the best police officers I've ever known. He worked hard all his life to help people and make our neighborhood a better place." To show her pride, Mrs. Constance smiled and nodded as she thought of her husband. She said in a soft voice, "That's right. Henry always thought it was important to help others." Officer Martinez looked at Gibson with a serious but kind face. "Mrs. Constance told me all about you, Gibson. She said you've been helping her and hanging out with her. That's the exact thing Henry would have loved to see." Gibson was proud, happy, and a little shy at the same time because he was the center of attention. He had no idea how much his small acts of kindness would mean to so many people. Officer Martinez said, "You see, Mrs. Constance wants to honor Henry's memory, and she thinks that helping you, Gibson, is the best way to do that." Gibson's eyes got really big in shock. There were tears in Mrs. Constance's eyes as she smiled at him. Mrs. Constance said with tears in her eyes, "That's right, dear. Henry always thought it was important to put money into the future and help kids reach their full potential. Just that's what I want to do for you." Mr. and Mrs. Anders paid close attention, with surprised and thankful looks on their faces. When Mrs. Constance and Officer Martinez showed up at their door, they hadn't planned for things to go this way. If you are still watching this story, then it means you are enjoying it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Officer Martinez told Gibson, "Mrs. Constance has set up a college fund for you, just like Henry would have wanted. She wants to make sure you can follow your dreams." Gibson was shocked. He tried to figure out what was going on by looking at Officer Martinez, then Mrs. Constance, and finally his parents. He had been kind and friendly, and now those things were coming back to him in ways he never thought possible. The officer reached into his pocket and took out an envelope. He gave it to Gibson with a smile on his face. He said in a soft voice, "Mrs. Constance asked me to give this to you. Gibson took the envelope with slightly shaking hands. When he looked at Mrs Constance, she gave him a positive nod, and her eyes were filled with happy tears. Mrs Constance said in a soft voice, "Go ahead, dear. Read it." Gibson carefully took the letter out of the envelope and spread it out. While he was reading, his mouth dropped open in shock and his eyes got bigger. The letter started, "Dear Gibson, your kindness and compassion have touched my heart in ways I never thought possible. You've brought joy back into my life and shown me that there is still good in the world." Gibson's parents leaned in close and paid close attention as he read the letter out loud. Mrs Ondas put a calming hand on her husband's shoulder. They were both moved to tears by the kindness they saw. Gibson read, his voice shaking with emotion, "I've decided to set up a scholarship fund in your name to honor the memory of my husband and to make sure that your bright spirit continues to shine. This fund will give you the tools to follow your dreams, no matter what they are." Mrs Constance gave Gibson a soft smile as she watched him take in the news. The letter went on to say, "I want you to have every chance to make a difference in this world, just as you've made a difference in mine." Gibson looked up from the letter and met Mrs Constance's eyes. He whispered, "I don't know what to say." He was so thankful. Officer Martinez came up to Gibson and put a soft hand on his shoulder. "Son, you don't need to say anything. What you did spoke louder than any words you could have said." Gibson put the letter down, and his hands started to shake a little. He looked up at Mrs Constance with tears in his eyes. Everyone in the room was moved to silence for a moment by how kind she was. The first person to speak up was Mrs Ondas. The woman spoke with a heavy heart. "Oh, Mrs Constance, this is, wow, that's really cool." Mr Ondas wiped a tear from his eye and nodded his head in agreement. "We don't know how to thank you for this," he said in a voice that was almost whispery. With the letter clenched in his hand, Gibson slowly stood up. He went up to Mrs Constance, who welcomed him with open arms. Gibson jumped into her arms right away and buried his face in her shoulder as tears ran down his cheeks. Gibson said, "Thank you," but Mrs Constance could not understand him. "Thank you very much." Mrs Constance kindly patted Gibson on the back. Her own tears came freely. She said in a soft voice, "No, my dear boy. It should be me who thanks you. You've made my life so much better." When Mr. and Mrs. Ondas joined in, they gave Gibson and Mrs. Constance a group hug, as everyone in the room shared this moment of deep love and thanks. There were sniffles and quiet sobs. Officer Martinez stood off to the side and smiled as he watched what was going on. He was touched by the act of kindness and generosity that was happening in front of him. As they moved apart, Gibson looked up at Mrs. Constance with eyes that were edged in red. He really meant it when he said, "I promise I'll make you proud. Like you and your husband did, I'll use this chance to help other people." Mrs. Constance put her hands around Gibson's face and looked at him with loving eyes. "Dear, you've already made me prouder than I ever thought possible," she said in a soft voice. As the emotional moment ended, Mrs. Constance reached into her bag while her hands were shaking. A small satin box came out of her purse, and she held it gently while her eyes filled with memories. Her voice was soft. "Gibson, I have something else I'd like to give you." Gibson looked at her with interest. Tears were still in his eyes. When Mrs. Constance opened the box, she saw a beautiful old watch inside. With the soft light in the living room, the gold face shone and the hands ticked steady. "This was the most important thing to my husband," Mrs. Constance said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He wore it every day of his service, and it showed how much he cared about helping people." Gibson's eyes got bigger when he understood what the gift meant. He looked at the watch, then at Mrs. Constance, and then back at the watch again. He couldn't say anything. The watch was taken out of its box and held out to Gibson by Mrs. Constance. She told him, "I want you to have it. It's a reminder of the love and kindness that you now bring to the family." Gibson took the watch, but his hands were shaking. He rolled it around in his hands and was amazed at how heavy it was and how detailed the carvings were on the back. He could feel the love and history moving through it. Mrs. Constance, don't know what to say, Gibson stuttered, shocked by the kindness. This is too much. Mrs. Constance smiled through her tears as she shook her head. Yes, that's right, dear. You were kind and didn't care about yourself like my husband did every day of his life. You should now wear this watch. Gibson carefully wrapped the watch around his wrist and felt how heavy it was. When he looked up at Mrs. Constance, his eyes were filled with purpose and thanks. He made a serious promise. I promise. I will keep this gift. I'll remember the love and kindness it stands for every day as I wear it. I will do my best to live up to the tradition it brings. It made Mrs. Constance's heart swell with pride and love as she pulled Gibson into another warm hug. She said in a whisper, I know you will, my dear. I'm sure you will. The Anders looked at each other deeply, and their hearts were full of love and warmth for both Gibson and Mrs. Constance. Mr. Anders cleared his throat and spoke with a powerful voice. Mrs. Gay, we've been thinking about something important, he started. Mrs. Constance looked up, and her happy tears were still shining in her eyes. She turned her head to listen to what Mr. Anders had to say. Mrs. Anders walked up to Mrs. Constance and put a soft hand on her shoulder. A soft voice said, We've seen how much happiness you've brought into Gibson's life and into ours. You've become a very important member of our family. Gibson's eyes lit up as he realized where this talk was going. From his parents to Mrs. Constance, he looked, and a hopeful smile spread across his face. Mr. Anders went on, his voice soft and serious. We'd like to ask you, Mrs. Constance, if you'd be interested in joining our family for good. You'll always be welcome here, not just as a neighbor or friend, but as family. Mrs. Constance quickly put her hand to her mouth, and her eyes grew wide with surprise. She was stunned for a moment, because the offer was so much to take in. You want me to be a part of your family? What is it? She asked in a voice that was almost a whisper. Mrs. Anders said yes, and her eyes were filled with tears. Yes, we do. It would be great if you could accept. Gibson moved forward and took Mrs. Constance's hand. He begged her, please say yes. You're already like a grandmother to me. Mrs. Constance looked at all the kind faces that were around her. She felt warm all the way through her chest. It was a sense of belonging she hadn't had in years. As she said yes, happy tears ran down her face. Yes, she said, and her voice choked up. Sure, I'd love to join your family. You've already given me a lot, and now this. I'm so thankful I can't say it. Everyone in the Anders family gave Mrs. Constance a big hug, with Gibson in the middle, his arms around his new grandma. There were laughs and happy tears in the room as they praised their growing family. Gibson put in even more effort into his studies as the weeks turned into months. His new grandma, Mrs. Constance, loved and supported him, which made him even more determined to do well in school. Gibson would rush over to Mrs. Constance's house every afternoon after school to tell her about what he had done that day. When Gibson walked through Mrs. Constance's door with his backpack over one shoulder and a stack of books under his arm, Mrs. Constance's face would light up. She would pay close attention as he talked excitedly about his lessons, his eyes shining with joy. Do you know what, Grandma Constance? Gibson gushed one day, almost bouncing with joy. My science project got an A+. Mrs. Constance was very proud of her child. That's great, Gibson. I was sure you could do it. Tell me everything about your project. Mrs. Constance felt a rush of love for Gibson as he went into great detail about his project. He had become such an important part of her life and was so smart and clever. Gibson Constance was always driven by the thought of the college fund Mrs. Constance had set up for him. He knew what a great chance he had been given and was determined to make the most of it. He made it a habit to read textbooks late at night and go over his notes first thing in the morning. Gibson's teachers also saw that he had changed. In class, he was always the first one to raise his hand, ready to answer. His assignments were always well thought out and based on solid study. As he worked harder at things he had been having trouble with before, he started to get better at them. One night, Mrs Constance brought Gibson a plate of warm cookies and a glass of milk, while he worked on his chores at her kitchen table. She looked at him for a moment, her heart swelled with love and joy. "You know, Gibson," she said in a soft voice, "your hard work really does inspire me. This is the start of a wonderful life." As Gibson looked up from his book, a smile of thanks spread across his face. "Thanks a lot, Grandma Constance," he said. "I want to do my best because of your help and the scholarship fund." As the years went by, Mrs. Constance became an important part of the Ondas family. Her presence always brought comfort and knowledge, and their home was full of love and fun. At Gibson's school, Mrs. Constance sat in the bleachers one cool fall afternoon and watched him take the stage for the science show with pride in her eyes. As Gibson happily showed the judges his project, a complicated model of renewable energy sources, he stood it on the table. I could feel Mrs. Constance tense up as I spoke. She whispered to the woman next to her, "That's my grandson." Her voice was filled with happiness. Later that night, while the Anders ate a home-cooked dinner to enjoy Gibson's first-place ribbon, Mrs. Constance told them stories about her late husband's adventures as a police officer. Gibson paid close attention, and in his mind, colourful pictures of bravery and devotion came to life. As the school year went on, Mrs. Constance's face became more known at school events and parent-teacher conferences. She was very proud as she sat next to Mr. and Mrs. Ondas and listened to Gibson's teachers praise his progress and hard work. Mrs. Constance's kitchen table turned into a place to learn in the afternoons during the week. She sat next to Gibson calmly and helped him with his homework. She also told him about her own life to make his lessons more real. History came alive in her stories about the Great Depression, and math problems were easier for her because she had spent years changing recipes and learned a lot about fractions. "You know, Gibson," Mrs. Constance told him one day as they read his social studies book, "we didn't have all these cool gadgets when I was your age. Things had to be taught the old-fashioned way." Gibson looked up, and his eyes were very interested. "Really? How did you get it done?" Mrs. Constance laughed and began telling a story about her school years that made Gibson laugh and want more. The Anders asked Mrs. Constance to move into their empty room as winter got closer. With tears in her eyes, she said yes to the offer with a thankful heart. Now, Mrs. Constance's famous pancakes filled the house with smell every morning, and at the end of each day, the family met in the living room to tell stories and laugh. The bond between Gibson and Mrs. Constance got stronger every day during the winter. Spending the afternoons together became a special tradition for them. They laughed, learned, and had deep talks. On a snowy afternoon, Mrs. Constance's eyes sparkled with fun as they sipped hot cocoa by the fireplace. She said to Gibson, "You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be a famous chef." That voice was full of love. Gibson's eyes got really big in shock. "Really? I had no idea about that." Mrs. Constance nodded, and she smiled in a sad way. "Yes, my mom taught me all of her secret recipes while we spent hours in the kitchen together." Gibson leaned in closer, wanting to know more. "Where did that dream go?" "I met your grandfather, fell in love, and found a new dream building a life with him," Mrs. Constance said in a soft voice. Gibson thought about this for a while. "Do you ever wish you had become a chef?" Mrs. Constance gave a hard shake of her head. "Not for a second. It's okay when our dreams change. Life with your grandfather was better than any dream I could have thought of." Gibson began to talk about his own dreams after hearing Mrs. Constance's story. She heard about his dream to be a creator and make the world a better place by making useful things. Mrs. Constance paid close attention, and her eyes lit up with joy. She reached out to squeeze his hand and said, "You have such a big heart, Gibson. I am sure you will do great things." Their talks got deeper as the weeks went by. Because it was hard for him to talk to his parents about his fears and worries, Gibson told Mrs. Constance about them. In response, Mrs. Constance talked about her own problems and told Gibson stories of strength and determination that made him want to do better. With each story they told, their respect for each other grew. Gibson was always amazed by Mrs. Constance's kindness and intelligence, while Mrs. Constance was always surprised by Gibson's strength and intelligence. Gibson looked up at Mrs. Constance with a serious face one night, as they worked on a jigsaw project together. He said in a soft voice, "You know, Mrs. Constance, I'm really glad you're now part of our family." Mrs. Constance's eyes filled with happy tears. She answered with a teary voice, "Oh, Gibson, you have no idea how much that means to me. You have made my life so much better." As spring got closer, Gibson was having a hard time with a school project. His teacher had told the class to make a talk about a big event in history and how it still affects people today. Gibson was stressed out because he didn't know where to start or how to handle such a big job. One afternoon, he was sitting at Mrs. Constance's kitchen table, concentrating. Mrs. Constance saw that he was upset and told him so. "What's wrong with you, sweetheart?" she asked him softly as she put a plate of warm cookies in front of him. Gibson sighed and pushed his book out of the way. He said, "It's this big project for school. I have no idea where to begin or how to make it interesting." It made Mrs. Constance's eyes shine. She pulled up a chair next to him and said, "Oh, history. That was always my favorite subject. What is the project about?" Mrs. Constance paid close attention as Gibson talked about the task. She gave him a warm smile when he was done. She started, "You know, this makes me think of a project I worked on when I was about your age." Her voice changed into a story-like tone that caught Gibson's attention right away. Mrs. Constance talked about how she had trouble with a similar task until her grandfather helped her see history as stories told by real people, not just dates and facts. She talked about how she had brought her presentation to life by using personal stories and daily things from the time. When Gibson heard Mrs. Constance's story, it made him feel excited and motivated. He yelled, "That's so cool. That's a new way for me to think about history." Because of how he responded, Mrs. Constance kept talking about more things from her past. She told Gibson about the creative ways she had solved tough school problems, stressing how important it is to think outside the box and be sure of yourself when facing difficulties. As they talked, Gibson started to write down thoughts. He was no longer angry, but excited. Mrs. Constance was proud of him and watched him work, giving him gentle advice and support. Her voice was soft. "Remember, Gibson, believing in yourself is the first step to achieving great things. You're kind and have great ideas that should come through in your project." Gibson nodded, and he felt a rush of confidence. He was sure that he could make something truly amazing with Mrs. Constance's help and his own imagination. Gibson was thankful for Mrs. Constance's advice and help as he continued to think of ideas. He realized again how lucky he was to have her in his life. Gibson threw himself into his school project with Mrs. Constance's help and his renewed drive. He spent a lot of time studying, writing, and polishing his presentation. The days went by quickly because he worked hard, motivated by his love for the job and the support of his new grandma. Gibson was sure of himself when he stood in front of his class on the day of the talk. His project, a vivid and interesting look at the civil rights movement, caught the attention of both his teacher and students. I agree with Mrs Constance that he brought the time period to life with personal stories and everyday things. His teacher's eyes got big with surprise and happiness. As Gibson spoke, his voice full of fire and understanding. His classmates paid close attention because he had taken a different method. The room went wild with cheers when he was done. Gibson's teacher was so proud of him that she said, "That was great. Your talk really brought history to life. I've never seen a kid your age come up with such a creative and interesting way to teach." Gibson's cheeks turned red with pride as his friends added their own high praise. It made him feel good inside to know that he had done a good job. Late that same day, Gibson smashed through Mrs Constance's door with a huge grin on his face and yelled, "Mrs Constance, hi, Mrs Constance, I did it, my project turned out great," as Gibson talked about his show and the compliments he had gotten. Mrs Constance's face lit up with happiness. She paid close attention, and her eyes were filled with love and pride. She gave him a warm hug and said, "Oh, Gibson, you've done great. Keep in mind, though, that this success is all yours. You worked hard." Gibson gave an angry shaky head shake. "Oh no, Mrs Constance, you made it possible for me to do it. Your lessons and stories were very helpful. You changed the way I look at history." Mrs Constance had tears of happiness in her eyes. She gently rubbed Gibson's hand and felt a rush of love for this amazing kid who had brought so much joy into her life. As the days went by, Mrs Constance told more stories about her late husband, Officer Constance. She talked about how he always stood up for justice, how kind he was to others, and how he believed in the power of community. Gibson paid close attention, his young mind taking in everything. Their porch was full of people on a sunny afternoon, and she held her husband's badge in her wrinkly hands. Her voice was soft from remembering. "You know, Gibson, Henry always said that helping other people is what makes you strong." Gibson leaned in and looked at her with wide eyes. "Really? What did he do to help?" Mrs Constance smiled, and her eyes sparkled. "Oh, in lots of ways. He would do anything to help a lost child find their parents or give someone food when they were hungry. He thought that being kind could make a difference in the world." Gibson gave her a serious nod as he thought about what she said. "Wow, Mrs Constance, that's amazing. Yes, I also want to be like that." Mrs Constance slapped his hand and said, "You already are, dear. The fact that you were kind to me shows that. We can always do more, though." Gibson kept hearing about her husband's values from Mrs Constance over the next few weeks. She told him how important it is to be honest, work hard, and understand other people in all areas of life. Gibson learned from these things. He began to stand up for kids who were being picked on at school. He also helped his parents more when they didn't ask. And he looked for ways to help people in the area, just like Officer Constance used to do. Gibson saw old Mr Jenkins having a hard time with his groceries one day. He made his way over to help right away. Gibson thought about how proud Mrs Constance and Officer Constance would be as they walked to Mr Jenkins' house. Afterward, when he told Mrs Constance about it, she cried happy tears. She spoke with a heavy heart. "Oh, Gibson, Henry would have been so proud of you. In the most beautiful way, you're carrying on his work." Gibson's chest felt warm when she spoke those words. Officer Constance's spirit lived on through Mrs Constance's stories and lessons, and now it was a part of him too. It made Gibson's heart beat fast as he walked into the busy community centre. He felt like he had a purpose because of the bright posters on the walls and the happy chatter of the helpers. He thought back to Mrs Constance's stories about how hard her late husband worked to help others, and they made him want to do the same. Miss Thompson, who runs the centre, smiled at Gibson when he walked in. "Hi, Gibson. We're so happy to have you here. Are you ready to change things?" Gibson happily nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Anyway I can. I want to help." Gibson was shown around the centre by Miss Thompson, who told him about the different classes they had. There was a food bank, tutoring after school, and even a small library. Gibson's eyes got really big when he saw how many ways there were to help people in his neighborhood. Gibson was told that his first job was to help sort food bank gifts. He carefully put the cans and boxes away, making sure everything had a place. He thought about how each thing would help feed a family in need as he worked. He felt good about himself because he knew he was making a difference. Over the next few weeks, Gibson went to the community center a lot. He helped kids with their homework in the after-school program, read to little kids in the library, and even helped plan a day to clean up the neighborhood. Gibson was helping an old man pick out books from the library shelves one afternoon when he heard Miss Thompson talking to another helper. She said that Gibson is something special. He strikes a chord with me because he is always willing to help and wears a smile. It made Gibson feel proud when someone said that. He was following the lead set by Mrs Constance's husband, which felt great. Gibson was getting more and more excited about his time at the community center as the weeks went by. He felt great when he helped other people, which was different from any other feeling he'd had. Seeing people smile with thanks made him happy, and he knew that he had made their day a little better. After a busy afternoon at the center one day, Gibson went to talk to Mrs Constance about what he had been through. He told her all the ways he was helping people, and his eyes lit up with joy. Mrs Constance paid close attention and was beaming with joy. She said, "Oh, Gibson," and her voice was full of sadness. "That's exactly what Henry would have wanted you to do. One nice thing you do each day makes the world a better place." Gibson walked home from school with his head down and shoulders slouched. He got his math test results just now, and the big red D at the top of the page hit him like a punch. He barely had the energy to say hello to his parents as he walked through the front door. He then went straight to his room. Gibson sat on Mrs Constance's porch later that night and stared at his feet. He came over to talk like they always do, but he couldn't bring himself to say how sad he was. Mrs Constance saw right away that Gibson's mood had changed. "What's wrong with you, son?" she asked softly, and worry filled her warm brown eyes. Gibson let out a big sigh. He told Mrs Constance, "I failed my math test," and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I worked really hard to understand, but I just couldn't. Perhaps I'm not as smart as everyone thinks I am." The boy Mrs Constance had grown to love like a child broke her heart. She softly rubbed his hand with hers. "Oh, Gibson," she said with a voice full of understanding. "Everyone has setbacks from time to time. It doesn't mean you're not smart or strong." Gibson turned to look at her, and his eyes were still wet with tears. "Really?" Mrs Constance said yes, and a small smile played across her face. She started by saying, "Let me tell you a story about Henry and me. Helen was in school to become a police officer when we got married. He had trouble with some of the written tests, just like you're having trouble with math right now." Gibson paid close attention as Mrs Constance went on. "Henry was really down. He considered giving up on his dream, but we stood by each other. It became a game for us to study every night by making notes and other things. Henry didn't give up, even though it was hard." "What took place?" Gibson asked because he was interested. "Well, Henry did great on his tests," Mrs Constance said with pride. "He went on to become one of the best officers in the precinct. Not giving up and not being afraid to ask for help were the keys." Gibson could feel a spark of hope in his heart. "Do you think I can do better next time?" She gave him a squeeze on the hand. "Son, I know you can do it. Note that Henry and I weren't the only ones who had to deal with that problem. We had each other. I, your parents, and your teachers are here for you. It's okay to ask for help when you need it." With Mrs Constance's words of support still fresh in his mind, Gibson felt even more determined. He took a deep breath, nodded, and his eyes lit up with new determination. With more power in his voice, he told her, "You're right. I'm not going to give up. I will do better and ask for help when I need it." Mrs. Constance looked at him with a proud grin on her face. "That's the spirit, kid. Could we begin by taking a look at your math test? We might be able to work together to figure out what went wrong." Gibson didn't decide right away. He looked in his bag and took out the crumpled test paper. As they worked on each problem, Mrs. Constance carefully went over the ideas that Gibson had been having trouble with. The same way she and Henry did years ago, she used everyday things to make the math more real. Over the next few weeks, Gibson put all of his energy back into his studies. He stayed after school to get extra help with math from his teacher. He also worked on practice problems with Mrs. Constance and even asked his parents to test him at dinner. Even though it wasn't always easy and he thought about giving up, he remembered Mrs. Constance's story about Henry and kept going. Gibson was nervous about his next math test, but he was ready. It was almost like he could hear Mrs. Constance's soft voice directing him as he worked things out. In the end, he felt proud of himself when he turned in his work, no matter what happened. After a few days, Gibson walked into Mrs. Constance's house and waved his test paper around. He yelled, "I did it, Mrs. Constance," with a big grin on his face. "I got an A+. As Mrs. Constance gave Gibson a tight hug, her eyes filled with happy tears. She said with tears in her eyes, "Oh, my son, I'm so proud of you. So you see, you can get through anything if you work hard and don't give up." Gibson nodded, and he could feel a warmth going through his chest. He understood that this had taught him more than just math. He knew how important it was to keep going, ask for help, and have people believe in him. Gibson was thankful for the strong people in his life who were there for him. He told Mrs. Constance about his success. Gibson and Mrs. Constance sat down on the couch as the sun began to go down, sending a warm golden glow through Mrs. Constance's living room window. A soft sound came from the TV in the background, but neither of them paid much attention to it. They were focused on each other and the quiet time they had together. Gibson looked down at the watch on his wrist. It was Mrs. Constance's late husband's favorite. He felt a strong sense of duty and respect as he ran his fingers over its smooth surface. The watch wasn't just a present. It was a sign of their love, trust, and the strong bond they had made. Mrs. Constance saw Gibson's move and gave him a small smile. When she reached out and grabbed his hand, her rough fingers wrapped around his smooth ones. The stark but beautiful difference showed how their bond had brought people of different generations together. In a friendly, emotional voice, Mrs. Constance told her son, "You know, my son, when Henry died, I thought my days of being truly happy were over. But Yahweh made my life bright again." Gibson could feel a lump in his throat. He gave Mrs. Constance a light squeeze on the hand. He responded with a heavy heart, "And you've changed my life too, Mrs. Constance. Thank you for teaching me how to be kind and help others." There was silence between them for a moment, as they were both moved by how close they were. Even though there were years between them, the sound of the watch seemed to match the beat of their hearts. As they sat there with their hands together, it became very clear what their relationship really meant to them. A young boy helped an elderly friend fix his broken TV as a simple act of kindness, but it turned into something deeper and more life-changing for both of them. When Mrs. Constance looked at Gibson, tears came to her eyes. She saw in him not only the child she never had, but also a bright future full of kindness and hope. And Gibson saw in Mrs. Constance's knowledge, love that didn't depend on anything, and a person who lived the life he wanted to live. Have you ever become close to someone out of the blue, like Gibson and Mrs. Constance? Do you say yes or no? Write your answer in the box below. I'd love to hear your point of view. Also, please subscribe to my channel if you like the video. Thank you so much for your support. I spend hours and hours writing these touching stories for you.